Well, one of the things is you do things and then forget that you've done them. You're not very good at that. And so you lose stuff a lot, would be one characteristic. You don't follow through. Most people with addiction placate. They make promises not because they plan on following through, but because they don't want an argument or a conflict. People with ADD are excellent at that, right? And they mean it, right? Hey, remember to do this, remember to pick up the kids at 6 o'clock, right? 6:30, 6:45. I mean, we all have all kinds of stories where kids don't get picked up because dad forgot. In our case, we deal with men. It has to do with conversations. I don't know if you folks at home have ever had this happen, but people with ADD, it's impossible. I think it's impossible to have the TV on and have a conversation with your wife at the same time.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. I'm Randy Everett, your co-host. We're here today with our usual host, Dr. Greg Miller. Greg, good to see you again.
Again, good to be here.
All right. And as promised on our last podcast, we have come back for part 2 of a podcast with Dr. Russ Smidt. Russ, it's great to have you with us again.
Thanks, Randy.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. We were looking forward to this continuation of this discussion. On the last podcast, we were talking about anxiety and how it sometimes works in concert with ADHD. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the ADHD side of it today.
Yeah, absolutely. And we appreciate Russ's expertise as a retired pediatrician, spent 30 years just around these topics, specifically with children, but we also know how they show up in adults and specifically the men that we work with who struggle with sexual addiction. And as Randy said, we're going to continue the conversation and talk a little bit more about ADHD and the implications it might have on somebody's life. And one of the things that we did identify last time for both anxiety and ADHD is sometimes we can loosely use those terms. We can talk about barely having it or having a little bit of it. But what we're really trying to identify is what does it look like when it is a clinical diagnosis. And one of the things that you said, Russ, is the benefit is if it is identified from a clinical perspective, there's treatments, there's ways to get it addressed. It doesn't have to be something that we live with all the time.
Yeah, and we obviously don't have the scope to go into how to make your own diagnosis. That's where you kind of have to trust somebody, And so if you do find somebody to be evaluated by, I would make really, really sure that they are qualified. And, you can be a psychiatrist and maybe your area of expertise is schizophrenia and you don't see a lot of these other disorders. So, now with the internet, you can check up and see what people like to treat and find somebody that's maybe more specialized in the area that you're concerned about.
Along those lines, a lot of times it is kind of a self-diagnosis in that I'm trying to identify the symptoms that I have. I'm trying to gauge how significant they are. Are there any strategies? Let's say that I finally have gotten to the place where I want to look at this. I want to understand if it's a issue for me. Are there any tools or skills or strategies that you would suggest that help me to do a better job of self-awareness and self-diagnosis when I'm getting ready to go to an assessment?
Yeah, I think the website that I always recommend to start with is the National Institutes of Mental Health, the NIMH, and they have all kinds of information about these types of things. There's tons of self-surveys that you can do, and what I always recommend, and this is partly from my bias as a physician, is it'll speed things along tremendously if you do your own work first. So, for instance, if you want to say, okay, what does it look like to have an anxiety disorder? Type in anxiety disorder survey. Try and select out something that's a credible source. It could be Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic, it could be a university website, Harvard, whatever. Stanford has a good stuff. But and then go ahead and take the survey, and then write down what seems really relevant to you, right? And
would you say that part of the challenge, though, is if I don't have a lot of self-awareness, they may be asking me questions and the questions are very clear, but if I don't have a sense of myself, I'm not going to be able to answer the question well. Is it helpful if, like, I know I'm going to be taking an anxiety, questionnaire, to talk to people in my life about how do you experience me? How would you answer this question for me? Or does that actually skew the results that it's better just for me to answer it for myself without initially getting some perspective from somebody else?
Well, I think the thing that would be the slowest would be just to show up and says, "Tell me what I have." Right? That's going to be slowest. But if you go online and you take a survey for ADD, for instance, and there's a lot of them out there. There are some that I recommend, but you go through and I say, okay, pick the ones that you definitely resonate with, the ones that are obvious to you, and circle those. All right, and then hand it to if you're in a position where your wife can do this for you, have your wife do it. Otherwise, have a friend that knows you really well, have them do it, and then compile those and see where the overlap is.
Okay.
And then you take your top 5 to 7 or whatever, and now you're going and saying, these are the things that I'm dealing with.
Right.
And that's where you start.
Yeah.
And then you go from there.
Okay. So we are going to talk a little bit about ADHD and kind of the way that it might show up for someone struggling with addiction, both in the way that it contributes to the addiction and the way the addiction may be intensifying the experience. So what are some of the indicators that someone does struggle with ADHD? And let me ask you this. For the longest time, they didn't put ADHD together. It was ADD and I guess HD, I don't know. But what caused them to put them together? Because I know that for Mark, that it was always something that he maybe didn't fully agree with when they began to make it one diagnosis.
Well, the way these diagnoses come about, I'll give a little historical lesson. When these things were first described years ago, with Freud and the time of Freud and before, all these things were written out in longhand, and they were descriptive. Tell me about your life. And you'd write down the way his life sucks, basically, or her life. And you're writing down all these symptoms. Now, it came along that eventually they developed what's called the biological model of psychology or psychiatry. And that came about because medications started to be developed that could be effective. So not just talk therapy, not just laying flat on your back on the couch, but there were actually medical things that you could do and medical things you could identify. Now, if you're going to research something, if you're going to create medications for something, you have to quantify it. So you can't just write it down in longhand and have everybody with their own unique story. You have to say, well, their commonalities are this, 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 and this. So if you have 5 out of 7 of these and 3 out of 7 of these, and you don't have these, then bam, you have this code. And not only does the code help with reimbursement, but more importantly to me, it helps with doing an accurate study because you need just apples and apples studies. So as a result of that, we come into this place where people have this idea, and it's unavoidable, that either I have it or I don't have it, right? And what's true is eventually, this is my feeling, eventually we're going to get away from this type of thing. And eventually, as we learn more about the brain, not in my lifetime, but eventually we'll say, okay, you've got inattention that's coming from this part of your brain, and you've got anxiety coming from this part of your brain. And when we see that, there are specific remedies we do for that. So we don't have, we're not saying you have some kind of combination anxiety and attention disorder thing. You're going to say, okay, these are symptoms that you're troubled with. We're going to target that. That's, I hope, where we eventually get. But for now, we've got these labels, and the labels get changed all the time because they don't fit very well.
Right.
So you've got 2 kinds of ADD. You've got primarily an attentive type, actually 3 types, primarily hyperactive type, and then some kind of combined type. And most people have a combined type. And so it can look different. Statistically, boys are more likely to have the hyperactive predominant one. Girls are more likely to have the inattentive one, which makes it harder to diagnose. And the treatment is the same for all of them. And so it's a distinction without a difference in that sense.
So to bring them all together for the purpose of the diagnosis, it wasn't really significant because whichever one you had, the treatment was going to be the same.
It's very similar, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, there are some medicines that lean more towards one or the other, but yeah, it's an interesting, ADD is interesting because the number one thing you run into, both in my pediatric practice in parents and in adult men that we talk to now, is there, in fact, this just happened this week, there's a great fear about going on medication for depression, anxiety, OCD, any of these things. Medication in this area, there's an anxiety or fear around it. And it's not, I've never had anybody say, oh, I'm afraid to take this antibiotic, right? Or I'm afraid to take insulin, right? But there's something about the brain that makes people think you're treating their soul. And, it's just, here's my medical bias. It's just another organ. It's like the heart organ, the kidney organ, and there's things you can do to manage that. And so you have this anxiety about the medication. As it turns out, the medication with ADD started with Ritalin in the 1950s. And if you want to study a drug, you want something that's fast acting, that wears off quickly, and that has really clear signs of improvement. You're marking things that are really obvious. And so I think at the time that I last looked at this, Ritalin was, I think, the second most studied drug in the history of drugs. Wow. Because it's such a perfect drug to study. And so the safety record on ADD medications is outstanding. Just outstanding. And that doesn't mean that people, just take it without any difficulties. Every medicine has potential side effects, and there can be significant side effects with some of these medicines. But in terms of, danger or robbing you of your personality, that only happens if you're either on the wrong medicine or the wrong dose. If you're on the right dose and the right medicine, it doesn't. It actually releases your personality. Your parents and your friends and family, they're less distracted by all the stuff. They're less distracted by all the fidgeting. They're less distracted by all the difficulty sustaining conversations because your mind wanders. And some of these other things kind of get in the way of seeing the real you. And I'll have to stop. I could go on a long time about that.
Well, one thing I would say, I also just had a conversation with someone, and he was getting off of medication. And the way that he described it was, it felt like it muted him, that he felt less energized by life. He felt less passionate. Yes, the other things were true. Maybe his sadness wasn't as great. His anxiety wasn't as great. And I think part of it is, and it's kind of the question that I think people wrestle with, is at what point am I muted and what part am I simply more in that place of how I'm supposed to function, because we cannot live in the extremes and the intensities. And in some of our emotions, those intense emotions are actually dangerous. But we also want to try to live honestly and authentically. And I've also, we're encouraging men to get in touch with their emotions. And so if the medication is limiting access to some of my emotions, at some point, is it also limiting my ability to heal and move forward in my recovery?
I feel very strongly about this. If you have any kind of flattening, if you have any kind of side effect that is not acceptable, then you shouldn't be on that medicine. It's just as frank as that. And I would have, especially adolescents, that would sometimes come back and say, or they'd stop taking the medicine. Why'd you stop taking the medicine? Well, it made me feel kind of flat and not very much fun. And I would get a little angry about that. Because what they were thinking is, I either have to choose, being more productive in school, live a saner life and all the good things that came with the medicine, and be flat, or I could be myself and have trouble. And that's a false choice as far as I'm concerned. Right. There's so many different options, so you should never settle when it comes to medication. Yeah. And so if you're experiencing anything remotely like that, you need to be giving feedback to your prescriber. And maybe, there's always the possibility maybe you have the wrong diagnosis. Yeah. And so, I have no tolerance for anybody that believes they have to settle for that. Right. If you have trouble like that with your medicine, you should be talking to somebody and get on something.
I would also add that, and if you are on something that has been prescribed for you, that it's important that you just don't choose to get off of it because it's not working.
Thank you, Dr. Miller.
Yeah, that would be a conversation that you would have with the prescriber to let them know that, hey, I'd like to try something else, and let them move you through the process. Because what's true is, and I have heard lots of stories where somebody just quits taking it, and their assumption is that there weren't really any significant implications of that, and yet there can be.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you saying that. Some medications are different than others, but always, these aren't, these are medicines that are working on your brain. So it's not like, I'm only going to take 7 out of 10 days for my penicillin, which I also don't recommend.
Right.
you need to be checking with people. I can't tell you, for a while there it was really popular. It seemed to die down a little bit, but for a long time, people would they'd save up their ADD medicine in college, and they'd only take it before midterms and finals. Yeah. And so they'd have extra because they'd keep refilling it, and they'd hand it out. Everybody knew they had the medicine, and so they'd hand it out. Well, that's horribly dangerous, not very smart, and I don't recommend that.
Right.
And in the same way, going off the medication, like, I can taper myself off. Well, I'm a big leave it to the professionals guy. I don't do that with my mechanic. I don't say, hey, I'm just going to do half of what you tell me to do because I don't know anything about cars. I just say,
do you
just tell me
feel
what to
that
do.
Is it necessary, in your opinion, that ADHD is only effectively treated with a pharmaceutical?
Well, it depends. It depends. It's the most effective thing. If you have, if you just have a few symptoms of ADD, or if you think you have a little ADD, you don't have ADD as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
You've got to have really significant, impact, in all areas of your life. You're talking your relationships are suffering, you're losing stuff all the time. You break stuff because you're impulsively doing things. You're breaking rules, not because you're a rule breaker, because you just forget the rules. You're talking out of turn in class. You're in trouble all the time. You're just really struggling with this. It's not something. It's just not a matter of I'm a little hyper or I'm a little inattentive. It has to be. You really have to be sure that you're in the really significant category, and that's true of any medicine. And in fact, if you look like antidepressants, people break it down into mild, moderate, and severe depression. Severe depression is the only one where the medication really is shown to work. So I feel the same way about all these medicines. These are strong medicines and should only be used in cases where it's really necessary to do.
When we talked about this in the last podcast, but the idea is that, and it's consistent, that if I have this temporary experience of distraction and forgetting, or a temporary experience of a rush of energy and activity, then it's not that clinical ADHD that we're talking about. It's constant, it's consistent, and that's where the consequences come from, where it's consistently you're disruptive. And because you're a pediatrician, we're using images sometimes of children of school, but it also shows up in adults who have difficulty functioning at work. They don't finish their projects. Right. They are seen as disruptive in the community. So it's not just an issue where, I just dealt with this when I was a kid and now it's not that big of a deal, but it shows up in marriages. It shows up in workplaces.
Sure.
And we as adults are seeking to understand what are the things going on for me that are causing these challenges in my life as an adult.
Yeah, I mean, to give you a couple of examples, one would be, I took care of a guy that had been kicked out of every school in his school district. He was down to his last one because his ADD behaviors were so intense. They couldn't handle him. He kept, picking on kids and impulsively getting in fights, and he was just all over the place. And so, there's a kid that really needed some help. There could be relationally, you have somebody that has a hard time making friends because they're impulsively saying things that get them embarrassed and teased and picked on and bullied. And they just don't have that little pause button in their head that says, maybe this isn't a good idea to say this. Maybe this isn't a good idea to do this. And they get into trouble. Or they have this group of friends, which when they're not in school, they seem to be intellectually compatible, but everybody else in their friend group is getting 2 grades higher than they are. And so they're getting really depressed about how, I'm studying as hard as or harder than these guys are. Or they're easily overwhelmed. Part of ADD is not being able to break down things into steps, and so they're easily overwhelmed by things like math problems or cleaning your room. Somebody with ADD goes into a room and doesn't know where to start, and they just break down, or else they do something, they start doing something, and then they get distracted, and it takes them 4 hours to clean their room, right? Then they're in trouble all the time. How come your room isn't clean?
Right.
Well, or you say, okay, kids, go grab your shoes and your backpack and meet us in the car. We're late for church, right? And the kid with ADD does 1 or 2 out of 2, and then he's gone. He's doing something else. Now he's in trouble because they made the family late for church. And so, it can have all these social implications that can be problematic. And with the addiction, there's also, part of that can sometimes the ADD can create an environment where you're looking for some relief from the difficulty, the chaos that the ADD is creating for your life. And sometimes that can lead to looking for ways to medicate it.
Yeah, well, and I think that impulse control is significant, especially when it comes to the addiction, because the idea is if I don't have that control, I'm not able to limit my impulses. If I think it, I do it. And so therefore, as someone who struggles with addiction, and we can see this in many of the men that we work with, their recovery is going well, they're, doing good things, they're making great choices, but then they have that impulsive thought of, oh, I wonder what is going on here. I wonder what's happening at this place, or I wonder what's going on at this website. And if I have some impulse control, I can slow myself down and go, you know what, that's really not a great decision. I'm not going to follow through with that.
Sure.
I can understand that there are consequences. But with no impulse control, if I think it, I'm going to do it. And then all of a sudden I'm back in to all of this chaos, and I'm kind of wondering, where did that come from? Well, part of not having impulse control is also not being able to recognize the consequences of my choices.
Yeah, I would agree. It can be, and we should emphasize also that none of these things are an excuse for addiction.
Right.
Zero. These are explanations, not excuses. The internet is both great for ADD and horrible for ADD. It's great for ADD because you need a lot of information, and you get a lot of information. And so if you're a hot rod car guy, and you like doing research on hot rod cars, man, you can really get into that and get a lot of information and really feed that active Ferrari brain. But if a website, a little pop-up thing pops up and it's a news article and has nothing to do with sex, but your ritual, your history is you start, clicking on pop-up ads, and that's just the beginning of your ritual. You don't have that little pause button that most people have to say, well, I could click on that and it's not sexual, and I know this is the start of my ritual, so I'm not going to click on that, even though it's not sexual. The person with ADD has more trouble with that.
Right.
So.
And so what does, in your experience, working with men, what does it look like in the coupleship? You kind of mentioned the child trying to get out the door to go to church. What can ADHD look like in the coupleship?
Well, we should have Susie on. I think that would help a lot. Well, one of the things is you do things and then forget that you've done them. You're not very good at that, and so you lose stuff a lot. Would be one characteristic. You don't follow through. Well, that's pretty strong. Most people with addiction placate. They make promises not because they plan on following through, but because they don't want an argument or a conflict. People with ADD are excellent at that, right? And they mean it, right? Hey, remember to do this? Remember to pick up the kids at 6:00, right? 6:30, 6:45. I mean, we all have all kinds of stories where kids don't get picked up because dad forgot. In our case, we deal with men. It has to do with conversations. I don't know if you folks at home have ever had this happen, but people with ADD, it's impossible. I think it's impossible to have the TV on and have a conversation with your wife at the same time. Right? I still do that because I have ADD, and I have to turn off the TV if Susie wants to talk to me. I cannot kind of put it off to one side and pay attention to her. It's too distracting for me.
One of the challenges is not taking the symptomology of the ADHD personally. It's Deb and I did a podcast a while ago on this idea of depersonalizing, and this is one of those places where to recognize this is about the way the brain is functioning. This is not necessarily about the way that somebody wants to interact with me or wants to be with me. So if I ask somebody to do something and they don't follow through, it's very easy for me to go to the place of they're ignoring me, or they don't think I matter, or they're blowing me off, or they're dismissing me. But the reality may be that everything in them wants to do what they promised to do, but their brain doesn't have the capacity to hold on to that long enough for them to do it.
Yeah, so this is a good example of a conflict that can arise, is that it's easy for somebody with ADD to say, hey, I didn't mean to, right? I forgot to do it. I didn't mean to, right? It doesn't matter. The impact is the same, right? And so I always say the dishwasher because that's one of my jobs. So, hey, I'm going off to do a bunch of errands. Would you empty the dishwasher? And she gets home, the dishwasher is empty because I'm watching the ball game and I totally forgot. But she gets home and says, you didn't empty it. I'm upset. And I could go, well, it's my ADD. Sorry, learn to love me. Or I could say, well, it's not bedtime yet. I still could do it. The impact is the same. I made a promise and I didn't follow through. And so the correct response is, I'm sorry. I own, I made a promise and I didn't keep it, and I'm sorry. My ADD is for me to figure out. It's not for her to kind of say, okay, it doesn't matter.
I think that's the rest of the equation. When we talk about ownership, the first part of it is acknowledging. So I'm sorry, I did promise you I'd unload the dishwasher and I didn't. And then the second part of ownership is creating a plan to change. If I know that my brain is contributing to the fact that I don't remember, then I'm trying to understand that. I'm trying to get the resources. So I do have a plan to change. And then the third thing is I implement that plan. So instead of just saying, well, that's who I am, accept it, I'm able to say, well, maybe I do have ADHD and I want to get that confirmed. And so I'm going to take some of these assessments that we talked about. I'm going to go to some of these websites. I'm going to get more information. And then I'm going to talk to my own physician about it to see what might be possible. And then whatever suggestions I'm given, I'm going to be open to those and I'm going to consider it.
Right.
It's not just enough to keep apologizing.
Right.
Because that serial apology eventually will be meaningless without the, this is what I'm going to do to change, and now I'm changing.
Yeah, with the example I gave, the solution is if she asks me to do something now, I do it right away.
Yeah.
Always. And even if she says, hey, you don't have to do it now, it doesn't matter. If she asks me to do something, I just do it right away because otherwise I don't trust myself. I tried, writing things on my hand. I just still do this sometimes, enter things into my phone with a alarm. But if I can, I do it right away. And that's my way of managing it. And sometimes it interrupts our conversation, right? Something pops into her head. We're having a nice talk. And I say, sorry, pause on the conversation. I'm going to go do it and come back. And it's annoying, quite frankly. But it's better than me making a promise that I don't keep.
Right. And I think, just one final thing, I think that awareness piece is one of the gifts that we give to our community. That, like you said, it's not an excuse. It is a contributing factor. And the more that I can understand that, then the more I can take responsibility for it and change it.
Yeah.
And we do know just statistically that a large number of the men that struggle with sexual addiction and maybe all addictions also struggle with ADHD. And so if that is something that is a part of your story, and here's what's complicated. For those spouses who are listening to this and they are now diagnosing their husbands as having ADHD, our encouragement is to find the support that you need as a spouse to navigate this well and using our language and not getting into your husband's hoop and trying to manage the ADHD or the anxiety for him based upon our last podcast.
Yeah,
and we believe there's hope.
Yeah, especially with the addiction. Part of the addiction is preoccupation with your drug, and that can make you inattentive, right? And so the addiction itself can look like ADD. So there's, you could have both or one causing the other. It's not clear cut, and that's why it's important not to kind of do your armchair diagnosis and stay there.
Okay. Well, Russ, thanks so much.
I have to check one thing with Greg.
Okay.
Do you feel like this ends up with you being hopeful or less hopeful, this conversation?
I think it's more hopeful.
Okay.
I think because it's this idea of self-awareness always serves us. So if I become more aware of the things that are in my life that are creating chaos, if my brain isn't cooperating with my recovery, then there's that hope that there's things that I can do. What's also true is in order for there to be hope, there must be openness. And for that person that's sitting there going, well, I will never, and fill in the blank, whatever they're not willing to do, that actually limits their hope. So it's not about deciding I'm going to do it initially. It may just be I'm going to be open to the possibility of looking at this and maybe seeing it as a contributing factor.
Yeah, I see it as taking a tremendous amount of courage
Absolutely.
to step into that.
Anytime we move towards our chaos and take responsibility for it, that is an act of courage.
Okay, thanks.
And if you have the courage to reach out to us, we're here to help you. Go to faithfulandtrue.com, where you'll find lots of free resources and information about how we can help you. We offer the Men's Journey Workshop that we have every month here at Faithful and True. We also have the Women's Journey Workshop and also the Couples Journey Workshop that we do a couple of times a year. So if today's message has really struck a chord with you, we encourage you to check us out. And the online registration is available, or you can call our number, which is also on the website. So thank you for joining us today. Russ, thanks for being with us for 2 podcasts in a row. We appreciate your expertise and your opinions on all these matters. So if today's message has been helpful to you, we hope that you'll reach out to us at faithfulandtrue.com, and hope that this coming week will be a week that's filled with many blessings and with great vision.